So Mo Pedersen's my name. I'm the AgForce training person managing the workshop tonight. And we've got Kerry Cribb, and I'll let Kerry introduce herself very shortly. And then Steve Martin, also from Integrity Ag, who's going to be presenting tonight. So Kerry, could you please just quickly introduce yourself? And Kerry's going to be monitoring the chat and the hands up and inviting or letting people in. Thanks, Kerry.
Yeah, thanks, Mo. For everyone that I haven't met before, I'm the AgForce Southwest Regional Manager based in Charleville and cover the Southwest region for AgForce. Thanks, Mo.
Thanks, Kerry. And Steve, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly. My name's Steve Martin. I'll introduce our company as I've got a slide deck coming up, but I'm an extension and outreach manager with Integrity Ag. My background is in rural science. I was in feedlot production operations management for about 18 years before joining Integrity Ag a couple of years ago. And yeah, my role's really bridging the gap between the science and technical component of climate change and emissions accounting and general environmental reporting needs for ag and what to do on the ground. And I do a lot of supply chain producer workshops and educational stuff for the people who are doing the do.
Thanks very much, Steve. So tonight's plan is we have been delivered funding support from the Commonwealth of Australia through the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water under the Carbon Farming Outreach Program in collaboration with the Grower Group Alliance. So they're funding us tonight to run these workshops, and thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully some of you have actually managed to see us on our face-to-face courses that we delivered last year. So what you're going to see tonight is a very brief outline of carbon and the fundamentals of carbon, introducing carbon farming, and then how carbon works biophysically. And over to Steve Martin to talk about the supply chains and what's coming up into the future, hopefully, or what we know so far. There's somebody not on mute. If you could please make sure you're muted. Thank you. So if we look at the greenhouse effect, the sun produces rays which comes down and heats the earth, and some of that heat bounces back off the earth and goes back into the atmosphere. Now, the problem we have is these greenhouse gases form a barrier up in the top of the atmosphere, and they basically force the heat to bounce back onto Earth. So it traps the heat and keeps the Earth warm, and that's how we get global warming according to the current science that we know of at the moment. So what's the history of climate commitments? It actually goes back quite prior to 97 with Margaret Thatcher and her doings and setting up different stuff around the regions quite a long time ago. But in 1997, 37 industrial economies and the EU made a commitment to an average 5% reduction in greenhouse gases compared to 1990 levels over a 5-year period. Now, 15 years later, they re-looked at all those figures and realised that those targets were nowhere near being met. So they made the Doha Amendment in 2012 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 18% below 1990 levels over an 8-year period. So note, first it was 5% per year over 5 years, which is 25%, but 15 years later, they revised that to 18% below in an 8-year period to 2020. Then in 2015, they made the Paris Agreement, where all signatories agreed to carbon reduction targets. And they also permitted the sale of carbon credits by countries meeting targets to nations falling short, or companies that may need more carbon credits. So if you think about all your airplane companies, all they're going to do is burn fuel, so they're going to have masses of carbon negative, and farmers are producing carbon in some areas with carbon projects, so it allows the farmers to sell some of the credits to some of the other corporations. Then in 2021, COP26 in Glasgow, now 153 countries adopted 2030 targets. Nationally determined contributions, new rules for carbon accounting, transfer mechanisms, and plans for a global carbon market. However, China, India, and now US are not part of this deal. So some of the biggest emitters in the world haven't set their 2030 targets as yet, or joined these agreements. So in the big picture, you've got where we were in 2005, and we're heading down slowly towards our 2030 targets. And then you can see at the moment it's a bit of a stalemate where it's not moving crazily downwards over the last few years. And if you look at where 2050 is, there's certainly targets of being net zero by 2050. Well, if we're going to achieve that, there has to be some fairly large changes to be able to get there. So not sure how that's going to happen yet. And we'll see where science may take us, or changes to targets, or wherever we head. But I guess that's up to people above our pay scale to try and figure that out. So leaders across the world are heavily resourcing efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change. Australia has a net zero by 2050 plan. Now, there's certainly discussions as to what that might look if we had a change of government, but at the moment, that's the Labor government's plan, with an interim 2030 target of reducing emissions by 43% compared to 2005. Agriculture has been minimally impacted at the moment by many other industries that already have mandated pathways for heavy emission reductions. So what we have to think about is, what are the quick, easy ways what can we do right now to reduce some of our emissions without changing things too much. So just to show you how carbon works biophysically, hopefully this works.
This is an explanation of the carbon cycle in agriculture. It's based on a grazing system, but the same principles apply to a cropping system. It all starts with sunlight energy and the process of photosynthesis in plants, which allows plants to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and lock it away into a plant. You will notice that we've highlighted the letter C in its various forms of carbon, showing that carbon in CO2 is a gas, but carbon in the plant is CHO, which is a sugar, not a gas. The key point is that carbon takes many forms as it cycles through our agricultural systems. In a cropping system, we would then harvest that plant. In a grazing system, an animal will graze the pasture and convert the carbohydrate into animal products. The majority of the carbon consumed by the animal is belched out or breathed out as CO2 back to the atmosphere. The majority of the animal products or crop products eaten by humans is also respired back to the atmosphere within 12 months as CO2. If that was all that happened, the carbon cycle would be completely balanced, with all inputs returning to the atmosphere in the same form within a short period of time. However, a small amount of carbon entering the rumen of the animal is converted into methane, CH4, which is carbon in another gaseous form. Methane is fundamentally different to CO2 and has a far higher warming potential in the atmosphere for the duration that it's there. The animal defecates, and so there's fecal carbon in an organic form going back to the soil. Plants will leave litter on the soil surface as a form of organic carbon. As the plant grows, it produces roots, and these roots leave carbon behind either as root fragments or as root exudates of sugars. This organic form of carbon in the soil can either be in a larger fraction, which we call the particulate organic carbon, and turns over fairly fast through microbial action, perhaps in hours through to a few years. The smaller, more fractions of organic carbon in the soil are called humus. These are the more resistant fractions that last for decades through to hundreds of years. In the soil, there are billions of microbes that then work actively on this organic carbon as their food source, actively breaking down the carbon to release the stored nutrients back to the soil to allow the crop or pasture to grow. In the process, these microbes then release the carbon stored in the organic material as carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere, and the carbon cycle completes itself. In a cropping system, this process of mineralization may release 30 to 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year out of the soil organic matter. In a dairy pasture system, it can be as much as 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year from the organic matter. The point of carbon farming is to capture and make that cycle as efficient as possible, that we can transfer as much of the carbon from the atmosphere into product that we're interested in producing, which could be meat, wool, milk, grain, and crops. Carbon farming is therefore focused on maximizing the carbon from photosynthesis through to a product that goes to market as efficiently as possible. In the process, good carbon farming would aim to leave as much carbon in the soil as possible, capture some of the carbon in trees growing in the landscape, and minimize the amount of carbon lost as methane and as a nitrogen gas.
So as you can see on this diagram, having watched the animation, hopefully, we've tried to put some numbers onto these pools of carbon. So for example, let's assume everything's 50% carbon, so a 14-ton pasture would produce 7 tons of carbon into the ecosystem. Then let's assume you graze that fairly efficiently. That's 5 tons of carbon gone down the throat of the cow, and the cow respires that back to the atmosphere or releases it as meat, wool, milk, or as fecal carbon. So you can track this through, and it doesn't take you long to add up what we call a mass balance. Now, when we get to the nitrogen section, we're going to do a nitrogen mass balance, but this is a carbon mass balance. And so what we ask you to do is just simply add up the components, and you'll find that claims of 5 tons of carbon sequestration per year are just biologically impossible. You actually need to grow 200 tons of grass or pasture or crop in a year to have enough carbon left behind to accumulate at 5 tons per year. So it just is unlikely, because the microbes chew up that much on their own. So it brings us back to say, look at the diagram, and why we don't include all these pools in carbon accounting is because they're transient. They're here today, gone tomorrow. The only thing that then matters is, where does carbon stop in the landscape for a decade at a time? And it stops in a tree, can be up to 100 years at a time. It can stop in the mineral associated carbon pool in the soil. That's the slow pool that we called humus on the previous slide. basically because we haven't updated the animation, but it's now better to call it mineral associated carbon because that describes what it actually does. And then methane itself, which is in the atmosphere for about 14 years. So those are the only places where carbon stops in the landscape, and therefore carbon accounting only needs to account those pools of carbon. The rest is all a neutral transient cycle.
So that is the summary of how carbon works biophysically from Professor Richard Eckhardt from Melbourne University. And what does it look like if you've sequestered carbon into your ground? Well, here's a couple of places. So it's not hard to see which places have got higher levels of carbon for soil moisture retention. Now, looking at global warming potentials, basically each greenhouse gas does not contribute to climate change proportionally with the mass of that gas in the atmosphere. Some gases, tonne for tonne, have a much greater heat trapping potential. So how much greater is the ability for a gas to contribute to climate change for the same mass over the same period? So we look at GWP 100, so it's evened out over the equivalent of 100 years. So everything is converted back to a carbon dioxide equivalent. And when you look at a tonne of methane at this point in time is 27 times higher global warming potential than a tonne of carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide 273 times the global warming potential. So you can see that nitrous oxide is far worse than anything else. Where does nitrous oxide come from? Well, burning fossil fuels is one of the big ones. And it's a little bit debatable, and we talk about why can't we have GWP star. Dr. Richard Eckhardt just said, you know, methane lasts in the atmosphere about 14 years. So, you know, methane's 14 years, nitrous oxide is actually 400 to 600 years. So it lasts much, much longer in the atmosphere, hence it's much worse as well. But, you know, are we being penalised for cows producing methane in a GWP 100 system? And I guess that's where there's a lot of discussion at the moment and research being developed to try and find a number that's realistic. So carbon accounting, basically you've got scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 gives you a total net farm annual emissions. So your indirect emissions is basically everything that you purchase from upstream. So if you trade cattle, you buy in steers, those steers are your scope 3. However, they were somebody else's scope 1. So whoever sells them, that's scope 1, but then they become the new purchaser's scope 3. So what's your scope 1 and 2? Your scope 1 and 2 is all of your cattle, methane, manure, any fertilizer, urine, dung, crop residues, any energy that you have used, any urea or fertilizer that you've put onto your property and so on. And then if you have carbon projects and you've sequestered carbon, then you can take that off your emissions. And if you've sequestered carbon into the soil in a measurable way in a project, then you can count that as a negative as well to give you a total. So we're in the big picture, agriculture, basically, if you look at it by sector, you've got 92% is energy, 18% agriculture, industrial processes and produce use is 8%, waste is 3%, and then there's the negative 20. LULUCF. Land use change and forestry. So that is all your remnant forest, which the government locked up, and they count as part of their emissions. So that's why if you looked at all the positives, 92 and 18, and 8 and 3 definitely don't add up to 100, but you've got that minus 20 down the bottom that offsets those other things. So when we nut it down into agriculture and we start splitting it up, if you look at the pie graph, 70% is enteric fermentation or methane coming from livestock. If you look at the graph over here, the bottom checkered part is grass-fed beef, and then the light blue one is grain-fed beef, and then the next one is dairy, and then the next one sheep. So if you look at the emissions from beef, dairy, and sheep, you're looking at 70 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent is the prediction for 2040. We're sitting here at 2025 or 26, and it's very close to the same. It's maybe slightly higher, but not much. But if you go back to 1990, it was actually about 86 megatons. So we've come down, 16 megatons or 15 megatons. But as you all know, in the 1990s is where we had a huge reduction of sheep in the western parts of Queensland. So, and that's where all that reduction has gone. But you've had a slight increase in all the cattle methane because there's more cattle and less sheep, and it's evened out. But yeah, that's why there's such a large focus on enteric methane reduction and what can we do about it, because it's 70% of agricultural emissions at this point in time. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing, and if there's any current questions, if you'd like to put them in the chat or put your hand up, we've got a couple of minutes to answer any questions if you've got any. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over to Steve. All right, no questions at the moment. So Steve, if you'd like to start sharing and present your slides.
Certainly, Mo, and look, I thank you for the opportunity to be in front of producers and stakeholders of the industry. It's if there's any of that work that was just presented that you've got clarifications, happy to take questions later in the session. I've got a bit of a slide deck here, which just runs through from the perspective of the supply chain. So Integrity Ag team, we've been around for 10 years now. We've got our base in Toowoomba. We also opened an office a couple of years ago in Melbourne. We've got around 30 staff nationwide. We service every level of agriculture from on-farm, farm level accounting and project management, right through to full supply chain, retail level reporting and verification of outcomes. Our offering really is around professional service supply. So we work out what the problem is. We all come from a background of agricultural production, and yeah, our core values are integrity and innovation, trying to find a solution to those tricky problems with core science backing our work. And fundamentally, we care for agricultural production. So I certainly don't identify as an environmentalist in any way. I'm a production agriculture person, and my role and our role as a business is helping agricultural people be that fundamentally sustainable. So getting more out of a limited resource base, so maximising that output. We're independent. We do a lot of industry level research, but we're not stuck to a education institution or anything like that. It's purely fee-for-service work. We focus on the high quality sort of work. We do a lot of the grey hair type area space. We've got a number of long-term partners, and that's in those supply chains, particularly, or corporate agriculture. And we really understand how their production systems work. I've come from managing large-scale feedlots in the feedlot industry as a director of Alpha for a period, and most of our people, Doug handles our land sector carbon and biodiversity team. So there's fully trained ecologists and a number of PhDs through the business. So really, we bring that supply chain context to our approach, and it's not just always driven on an outcome or policy position. It's about what's best for every different client. So we do represent different viewpoints depending on the client and the client need. There's a bit of a list of our published work partners. We've got plenty of other supply chain partners who we just do private work for, but those are partners which we've done significant published works. What I'm going to talk about today, we've maintained basically the largest benchmarking program in the country, covering beef and sheep, animal fibres, pork, chicken and egg production, and around 70% coverage at a national scale of each of those sectors. So we've got hundreds of farm level verified accounts that support our modelling and our database capacity. But we recently completed an update to the national product carbon footprint for beef, lamb and wool, and those figures are adopted under the beef sustainability framework and the sheep sustainability framework. The interesting new parts to that bit of work this year was, for the first time, we've included LULUC, which is the land use change emissions. And so you see from Richard's image, the cycle piece that entails the livestock is just a small part of the whole biogenic cycle, and actually having on the ledger those changes in forest carbon stocks particularly puts the livestock reporting in line with what the national inventory reporting has. We also included the first time publication of boxed meat values, so that includes the processing emissions component. We included dairy origin beef into the system, so beef on dairy and dairy beef product into the beef report. And we did a fair bit of reporting for wool and the land use. First time we had land use change into the sheep and wool sector. The other component of work that's pretty fresh off the mint for us is actually a gap analysis on this particular funding stream. So the Carbon Farming Outreach Project, we received government funding through MLA and, in fact, Australia Pork Limited. We actually did two of the core sectors, and we did a significant gap analysis, and I'll refer to a few of those results. Carbon farming is sort of evolved into a space which also includes really emissions reductions and all of the carbon accounting component. And I guess it's all about context, understanding sort of who's talking about what and what they refer to with some of the language. So a lot of what I'm going to do is just try and paint that picture. There's four main megatrends that we talk about in this carbon space, and it's important to understand that context of who's asking about what number. The first is the government, and we've touched on a few of those settings. Our national government as an international commitment under the Paris Agreement to reduce its emissions by 43% from a 2005 baseline by 2030, and they've got a net zero ambition by 2050. Now, that doesn't have bipartisan support at the moment, but it's certainly where our policy setting is coming from and has come from for the past 10 years or so. The important thing about this is to understand whenever the government's talking about numbers, they're focused on controlling global warming. And so their promises are about net emissions accounting, absolute emissions, it's often called. So basically their goal is to meet a target that is how many total tonnes of emissions occur. And that's quite a bit different to what the ask is from these other megatrends. The second big one's the investment and finance space. And so recently you'll hear a lot about climate-related financial disclosures. That's not an Australian special thing. There's an international task force for climate disclosures, and there's a broad volume of economies who are bringing in this approach. The key difference here is government doesn't want to regulate ag. So the biggest emission of the national profile is the energy sector. 70% of emissions come from our mining and our electricity grids. And so they've set up what's called the safeguard mechanism, and they've set up a carbon market fundamentally, and that's where your ACCUs are traded, and they will regulate those large emitting companies and say that you need to offset your emissions by buying carbon credits. So there's actually rules and financial penalties for their emission profile. They absolutely don't want to go down that path with ag, and no government would like to do that. It would be suicide. So what they're doing in ag is setting structures like these climate related financial disclosures, whereby the industry will ultimately self-regulate. And so you'll have companies like Coles and Woolworths with different targets and ambitions, and the value of their share price will move around depending on investors' opinion of their green credentials or their performance reporting. So what the government's done is said you've got to report your climate-related disclosures as one of your now 4 compulsory financial returns with your tax return and what have you. And so they've set that up for the big end of town, and that allows the finance sector, basically the economy, to start valuing who's a good corporate citizen and who may not be. And so it's important when you start talking about those outcomes that they are often absolute emission reduction targets for some companies, and for other companies they're just product carbon footprint reductions. So we want to show that for every kilo of whatever product it is we're trading, there's a lower footprint of that product than there used to be. And that gets them away from these really absolute and somewhat difficult targets in that marketplace. The other big driver is the customer themselves, and they're also signing up to what you'll hear called SBTI targets, Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's a global initiative, and I'll touch on it as well. It comes with extra commitments like zero deforestation and those sorts of things. And nearly all of their targets will be driven under this product carbon footprint accounting, which means they can't control the net emissions that happened in the country, but they can control their purchasing decisions around their footprint of the product and where they get their product from. The fourth main one, and it is more significant than people think, is the primary producer themselves, and the quest to be a responsible steward of the land. There's a lot of natural capital tied up in your asset there, and you fundamentally want to not drain your farm of carbon. And you want to be able to maximise, the productivity for every 100 mil of rain you get and those sorts of things. So the primary producer is driving a fair bit of what they're doing as well. And they have often industry level reporting. So they'll often rely on, might be MLA or one of their RDCs to support through levy funds or through corporate investment at creating emission intensities and regional factors and things that can be used that takes the burden of reporting off the primary producer. So I'll just quickly go through what we can do at the moment, and there are some other presentations on the carbon calculator and that sort of thing. But the big question is like, what is this emission intensity? And the fact is it's different. It's time bound, so it's within a financial year usually or a calendar year, and it's also physically bound, so it's a single property with a property boundary and its emission component that happened in that year divided by the kilos or whatever unit of product that came off, might be litres of milk, and that provides an emission intensity. But an emission intensity for a litre of milk is not comparable to the emission intensity of a kilo of beef or a kilo of wool or a kilo of grain. And so you get this fair confusion around what your number is, this know your number journey. And different calculators, users will often create different outcomes because it's not standard what information you put in there. And so you can talk about things like weaning rate. Some people, well, we actually refer to that as how many cows exposed to a bull or used to a ram for every weaner taken off. But some people will call a preg testing rate, and then there'll be a weaning rate, will just be from marking the weaning. So you get these challenges of different people put different numbers in. So it's not standardized, and it does create a bit of confusion to all parties in the supply chain. So what the supply chain wants is they can get a textbook lookup value, a factor-based emission component. So that is a product produced in this given region has a typical footprint of such and such, and they'll say, well, I bought 17 tonnes of it, so there's my emission component for the product. The limitation there is that it doesn't pick up any improvement because you might be the best supplier in that region and you might have the worst supplier next door, and your supply chain can't recognise that performance difference or improvement year after year if the region isn't changing. So those sort of calculators don't serve all purposes, particularly in the supply chain reporting. So they're pretty good, those carbon calculators, for financed emissions. So the bank wants to know, I loaned you $1 million. How many emissions came off your farm in the 12 months time? That's pretty easy. Those calculators do the job. They also match what the government want to do, which is just a net emissions report. How much emissions came from beef production in 2024? There's the number. The challenge there is that they take these land sector emissions, this forest growth, and they apply it to the inventory in a given year. It's very difficult to apply that inventory change to a kilo of beef or a mob of cattle in a certain area. And so you've got this accounting difference, a fundamental accounting difference. So the gap analysis we did had a lot of findings. It was I think it was 26,000 words in the end of the report. But we did actually find there are a fair few emission intensities published out there already. There's actually 42 published emission intensities for beef, sheep and goat. The knowledge across the regions and species specific is considered pretty low. We did a fair bit of investigation about extension officers and their confidence in carbon farming communication and primary producers themselves. Victoria, New South Wales and Southern Queensland was fairly well represented. Tassie and the Northern Rangeland type systems were very underrepresented in the published work. And there was a real constraint around this different accounting methodology, the factor-based approach, GWP metrics. There's still relatively a fair bit of confusion around that carbon space. And we coined the word a couple of years ago for carbon fatigue. Yeah, a lot of people just feel that this is it's a really hard topic that continues to change. The narrative around it continues to change, and it can be really challenging. The key pieces on that emission intensity that are difficult to recognise in our accounting system is dietary quality from one farm to the next, genetic improvement that genuinely isn't picked up within the calculators from one farm to the next, and the use of low methane forages. So we know Leukina and Desmanthus significantly lower, 28% lower methane emissions from Leukina, but it's very difficult to do the accounting on that and verify those outcomes. And so they never hit your ledger. And so they're the challenges. We currently do have unreliable in terms of benchmarks for those emission intensity, but it's mostly due to that lack of standardisation. It's not that we haven't thrown a fair bit of work at it and done a fair bit of science. It's just a gap in the synthesis and standardisation and the governance of reporting those figures. So where do we go from here? In this supply chain, we take a slightly different approach to this scope 3. So they're interested in the product carbon footprint. And that is based around a very standard approach. So we use, there's an ISO standard, and it's 14067 is the main one for value chain reporting. And it's what we call this life cycle application. So it provides a carbon footprint rather than the other calculators provide a carbon account, which I'll get into the difference. Beef and sheep have actually got specified guidelines under the Food and Agricultural Organisation. So globally, there is structure and standard to measuring this. And that's the approach that we're using to provide the figures for our beef and sheep sustainability frameworks. So just to clarify, I think this is my major take-home message, is these differences between carbon account and a product carbon footprint. The carbon account is time-bound, and it's physically bound in a property. It generates this language around scope 1 and 2 and 3. So physically under your operational control is your scope 1 and 2s. The scope 3, either upstream or downstream, are those things that are emissions that weren't in your operational control. So they're summed up within the boundary and timeline, and they're great for tracking absolute emissions, so outcomes in a given year. They're reported in tonnes of CO2 equivalent. The alternative accounting structure is the product carbon footprint. They have this life cycle approach from cradle to gate, or it could be cradle to grave if you're doing those downstream scope 3 emissions. So packaging and refrigeration and all those emissions go right through to consumption level. They're inclusive of all the intakes and the inputs that go into producing that product and specific to the product. So you have to have an allocation step that puts an emission volume to a per head or a per kilo reality. They're summed up over the production cycle, which is usually often longer than a year. And they compare products in a benchmarking reality. So you got a kilo of this product, a kilo of someone else's product, and they can have distinctly different footprints. And the key part there is that number is very dynamic. You can have a bunch of weaners and each of them have their own footprint because they all had different growth rates. So for every day's feed consumption, they converted it into different levels of product growth. And so you do actually have this nuance of ability to track the productivity improvements and performance improvements. And we report them in CO2 equivalents per kilo of product produced. And one you can consider like your balance sheet. So you've got your emissions and your removals added up in a year, whereas the other we consider like a cost of production. And so it tracks it further through the supply chain. So to try and show you visually there, we've got, these are like the downstream components. Typically the value chain will report cradle to gate. So it won't, post-slaughter, it won't sort of pick up. But then you've got all of the emissions that come out of each of the production components in the supply chain. For each of those, there'll be inputs. There might be fertilizer application or drench or whatever those materials and products that go into the production system. There'll be transportation emissions through burning fossil fuels there. There'll be inputs of feed and fodders and supplements. And then you've got your scope 2s, so that energy generation that you turn the power points on at all of those different systems. And altogether that gives you the emissions profile. So it's like an emission intensity, but it's right across the production system. So an emission intensity could be the carbon footprint. If you're a cereal grain producer that turns off a product within one financial year, then that emission intensity is in fact the footprint of your grain going out. But for these livestock systems, they typically will follow multiple production sites and often multiple years. So that's what's included in our product carbon footprint, cradle to gate. But you've also got these accounting realities for soil and vegetables, so the removals of actual carbon sequestration. And so they also need to start coming into the reporting. So oftentimes people communicate their carbon footprint of the livestock only. And the biggest change that we'll see over the next couple of years is that we have to start reporting land use or land sector emissions. So our database, we've got over 6 million head of cattle assessed last year's reporting, 8 million head of sheep, and about 90% of the pork and 90% of the chicken industry and most of the pork. What we do with those supply chains is we understand their baseline. We help them set their targets of reduction outcomes. So that's what we need to do first. And you can't start looking at emission reduction unless you know where you're starting from. You can't manage what you don't measure, so to speak. And this is what they're looking for down the track. So they want primary producers to understand that baseline as well. And then you can understand what you can do about it and pull levers to change. So I'll quickly cover what the government's doing. They don't want to regulate ag. They introduced regulations for financial reporting so that the market can essentially self-regulate. There's also voluntary commitments that drives companies to try and change. So you've got competition between McDonald's and Hungry Jack's, both setting targets and trying to outcompete the ambition of one another. So to the retailers and particularly the fashion houses are terrible at making amazingly ambitious targets and then asking that of their supply chain. So what's coming out of that? Climate-related financial disclosures, SBTI targets, and these proprietary market type credentials. So you'll have individual brands making raising claims. Basically, they're the three drivers of what the supply chain is going to want from you, and all three of them will need some sort of verification and auditability. So that introductory accounting carbon is great for that carbon 101. But what the supply chain needs now is a measurement that's repeatable and can be audited. So climate-related financial disclosures are coming in three main waves, and the biggest end of town have to start reporting in the first year. That's this current year we're in. The Group 2s will follow the second year, and Group 3s the year after that. These guys need to report their Scope 1 and 2 emissions in the first year, and they need to report Scope 3, which is the supply chain accounting, in the second year of reporting. So to give you an idea, with employees over 500 and a consolidated revenue of 500 million, we're talking Coles, Woolworths, we're talking JBS, Tees Cargill. The guys who do processing plants have usually got, I should say the entities need to have 2 out of those 3 categories to trigger their requirement to report. So if their net assets or gross assets, I should say, are over that 1 billion or 500 million, you can see that bottom group, probably not the 100 employees, but the 50 million turnover and the $25 million worth of asset, there's going to be a fair few agricultural companies with that sort of asset base that turn over that sort of volume of trade in a given year. And so they're coming in the next couple of years. But also you'll have the Group 1 and 2s who need to report their Scope 3, so their supply chain emissions. What does it involve? It involves governance and strategy and risk management realities. Basically, it's trying to disclose your sensitivity to climate change and let the finance market, the shareholders effectively, decide whether you're doing well, meeting your targets, or full of baloney, whichever it might be. So it's the metrics and targets that those corporations need to report that brings in that ask for what is our supply chain's profile. They also need to do some scenario modelling. So they need to understand what are their risks if the temperature goes over that 1.5, that Paris Agreement target. And if it goes over the 2.5, they literally have to do scenario modelling on climate change and disclose what sort of impacts those changes might have on their financial realities. So we do a fair bit and the supply chain needs to get engaged, I guess, in that greenhouse gas emissions accounting and also that internal carbon price. So part of this disclosure will actually help the journey we're on for trying to get someone to pay for these positive outcomes. These companies will have to disclose as part of these metrics, probably not in the first year of reporting, but at some stage fairly soon, they will need to disclose what value they place on the abatement of a tonne of carbon. And so that will show a willingness to pay for some of these reductions or a willingness to pay for carbon insetting. So at the moment, all we can really do is say you got a carbon ACCU in a carbon farming project, and they're worth about $35 a tonne. But what you may have now is these companies going, well, we're happy to pay $100 a tonne if we can find emission reductions within our supply chain. And then you'll see a transition perhaps to insetting rather than that offsetting. The SBTI, I'll just go quickly. It's an internationally structured approach to getting corporate citizens to make a difference, to actually implement or encourage practice change in the supply chain. It includes all the land-based emissions, so FLAG targets is farmland and ag. And they make short term, which is typically 5 years. Nearly all of them make a 2030 target, and also a long term, which is usually that 2050 target. They then need to report annually on their performance progress, and it has these net zero, or they're not all net zero. They don't have to sign up to saying net zero, but some have 72% emission reductions by no later than 2050. That's the minimum target they can set in that long horizon. It also includes this no deforestation. There's often a lot of confusion around deforestation and carbon accounting. The reason that they get crossed over is there's land use emissions. If you've got regeneration of forest carbon or removal of forest carbon, then it hits your account. It now has to be reported. And so deforestation is a double whammy. It is something that corporate citizen doesn't want to have within its supply chain. But you can have emissions, so you've cleared regulated country or something, it still will hit your account as an emission because you've pushed over timber and burnt it, or it's degraded and gone into the atmosphere, but you're still not deforestation. So there's this the definition of deforestation won't resolve the fact that the emissions from your land use activities will still start to hit your account. And so those reports have to cover 95% of their Scope 1 emissions, and they have to cover 67% of their Scope 3s. And so that's where you get this supply chain needing to get verified accounts on at least 67% or 2/3 of their supply chain. There's an example of some of the companies who have signed up to SBTI targets. They're just the Australian activity ones. There's McDonald's, Hungry Jack's, Sainsbury's, all of these huge international, multinational agri and food businesses. When you actually add them up, we think it's over 80% of the domestic red meat market are already supplying into companies that have these emissions. The good news is they have mapped out where your savings should come from. They've modelled this. It's not just a random claim of a target. And as you can see there, land use change, or the reduction in land use emissions, is going to account for a good portion of the reductions. And if you add that to restored forests, so the actual removal, so tree planting or native veg establishment, agroforestry, and enhanced soil carbon, you actually get the vast majority of these targets that will come from what is essentially carbon farming activities. And whether that's into an offset market or whether that's priced in an insetting sense, that's what looks like the opportunity. The challenge for the ag sector is getting these improved agricultural emissions and the shifting of diets, particularly the ruminant diet. So that's the technical inclusion of feed additives. They're looking at 8% on productivity improvements and around 8% in those technical interventions to get to the SBTI target outcomes. So yeah, those targets can be absolute emission reductions. They can also be the physical intensity, so that's basically the carbon footprint. They can also be through renewable energy implementation, so getting rid of those Scope 2s. And they can also be measured in economic intensity. So you might have a company like Elders who actually report their emission reductions per $1 million of revenue or turnover. So they don't report it in a per kilo level. It's not a product carbon footprint. It's an emission efficiency in their dollar spend. And that's probably where the banks and finances will probably go to is, we're funding lower emissions activities rather than necessarily just a footprint. So to give you an idea, those are some of the biggest meat companies who have rather ambitious reduction targets by 2030 or 2032. And what they need annually is between 1.3 and 4.5% reductions. So we did the carbon footprint reductions for the beef sector last year. We published those. We included for the first time the grey bar, which includes the dairy beef. We've seen a 25% reduction over 44 years. Now, the earlier years were modelled. They weren't obviously absolute recorded, but our first publication was in 2018, 15. And so we've hindcast those estimates on productivity and historic kill sheets. We went through a heap of old kill sheets. And look, that's what we've achieved through, if you like, a passive improvement. So this is genetic improvement of our livestock, species improvement of our cropping systems. So just general resource efficiencies that we've found across ag. This is the beef model, but the same trend has happened in the rest of the ag sector. We've got these passive improvements, but they're 0.6% per annum. So we really need to, what the supply chain is saying is we need to do 5 to 7% per annum, better than that. But again, most of it's going to come out of that land sector emissions. This is the first time we put land sector emissions, and at a national scale for beef, we use what we call statistical land use change. So it's basically the whole map of Australia, the forest carbon changes and land use changes that have occurred. So what's been logged on the national inventory, as I said, as Mo said, the government already claims those forest carbon realities. This is the first time we've applied them to our livestock product. Across the country, it's actually still an emission, and so the key thing there is you've got to do what we call linear discounting. So the emissions that occurred from clearing 19 years ago, there's still a bit of those hitting our inventory today, because trees don't just break down in a year. Once you push them over, they sit there, and that the biogenic cycle has to basically, it's not until 20 years that they're fully just back into the atmosphere. So what that means is there's a legacy of land clearing that's still hitting our reportable account. And that's a key difference to what you're seeing in the National Inventory Report, which measures the forests and goes, yep, we got this much forest this year. So we've got this legacy reporting requirement. And that's where you find that the MLA under CN30 were saying, you know, we're 78% better than we were in 2005. But in fact, we haven't been able to say the same thing in product carbon footprint, because you've got this required reporting legacy of linear discounting. There's a big difference once you start applying that at state level. So Queensland has a greater legacy of emissions still hitting their account. In fact, the southern states are actually in net removals. So you get your livestock account and then you take off a kilo or two because of the forest carbon in those states. Whereas Queensland, you're still applying a historic emissions component to your footprint today. That's a bit of a double-edged sword, because it does mean that Queensland production has, if your supply chain has a baseline of 2018, you've actually got that high emissions back there where your baseline was. And so in the future, when we do get to net neutral or start to perhaps have removals in our forest, you'll have a huge percentage change, because the baseline already had those land use emissions and then they're diminishing. So it looks like improvement, I guess, in the accounting. So this is where we get to now is we know what the market needs, and we start to look at what can we do for reductions. And we actively have emission reduction plans implemented in supply chains at farm level. So we do your farm account and we go, righto, what does performance productivity improvement, that lever one, if you can get 5% better weaning rate, that'll look like this much difference on your emissions profile. If you put a methane inhibiting feed additive in your water trough, you could get this percentage reduction, and that technical intervention lever two would realise this. So we're actually able to report in a supply chain, like those flag targets said, you'd find those savings. We're actually starting to report them within a supply chain. So it's not just about that market saying, what's your carbon footprint, and hoping you're better than you were and maybe not buying from you. It's this really integrated approach within a supply chain of trying to move the lever. The other two opportunities are, of course, those carbon farming opportunities, both soils and there are methods, ACU methods and tree methods. What we've done is drafted a couple of insetting methods, which basically we've written some of those carbon farming methods as a company. We've now got some insetting opportunities which basically follow the same principles as the ACCU scheme, but they're ways of verifying the reduction or the removal onto a supply chain reporting component. So we look at like a long list of options. We go through your profile, your farm profile. We do a short list then of reasonable stackable options, and we go, righto, let's initiate a reduction plan. And we've got some producers who are in their 5th year of reporting and shown emission reductions. We have one beef producer in a supply chain that achieved 11% reductions in emissions in a single year through implementing or changing the volume of grain finishing that he had and including some supplements into those grain feeding systems. So those sorts of reduction levels are achievable. And we've proven that. So yeah, we've got implemented reduction plans that are achieving in excess of what those supply chains want. Does that mean they're all going to see the outcome that they've promised the marketplace? Probably not, but it is great to see that we've seen that reduction. And then we've developed that capacity now to do direct land use change accounting, deforestation detection. So if your marketplace, like the EUDR, so EU access, will put restrictions on that measurement of deforestation, we can do a risk assessment and say, look, these are your forest areas that are at risk of being called a native forest. The new federal legislation has significantly shifted the goalposts. Basically, there's now a federal approach to the definition of that, of deforestation, and so it's basically a 15-year age. If it's been there for 15 years on a satellite, then it's classed as naturalized forest, which will put some limitations. So we do risk assessments there. Basically, we've also do natural capital assessments. So there's an emerging market of valuing other natural capital assets.
And can I just interrupt there, Steve, for a second? I know you're getting very close. We're just 2 minutes over time already, so we want to finish up
slide,
mate. Please. Yep, very good.
Yeah. So take homes Australia can and does lead this reporting capacity. The likes of a JBS, they see the Australian market much more mature in its ability to measure and report outcomes than a lot of its other international operations. There's a wealth of information out there, but it's all about standardising and having that commodity level governance so we know what number it is we're referring to and meeting the need of the supply chain. That know your number sort of narrative is shifting, and there's actually a range of numbers. The good part about that is it allows you to recognise your productivity benefits and your specific outcomes for your business. The footprint story that the supply chain's looking to talk emissions intensity, but it's now really about this product carbon footprint that follows ISO and GHG protocols. And land sector is the new horizon. So land use change emissions will be required by the supply chain. They'll be asking for those accounting outcomes as well. So that's me, mate. Happy to open to any questions or clarifications or whatever might be there.
Thanks very much, Steve. Really appreciate that. There is one question, and I'm just going to share also for those people that are in a rush to leave. In the chat, I've put in the link for a survey, given that it's government funded tonight. They would really appreciate your input into what the quality of the workshop was like. So if you can either click on the link in the chat or scan the QR code, and I'll also just share that so you can scan the screen. And while we're at that, Steve Hamish asked, is there any expectation of agriculture emissions being included in Australia's net zero comments? And you touched a little bit on that, but if you would like to comment further.
Yeah, absolutely. So the government has made net emissions targets, and the realities are that the majority of their removals will come from country that is managed agricultural land. And that's why they're funding this exact program, the Carbon Farming Outreach Program. There's funding in regulation over industry and renewable energies and things, but the big piece of funding in both R&D and extension and education is the government trying to get agriculture and land managers better understanding the opportunity that sits there to achieve that national outcome.
Thanks, Steve. Any other questions? And if you don't want to use the chat, please put your hand up. We're happy to take questions from the floor. Kerry, you wanted to comment there before?
No, you're right, Mo. I was just going to read out Hamish's comment.
Okay.
Happy to take questions on notice too, Mo, if any of the participants have got sort of inquiries they sleep on. You'd fine to shoot an email through or something like that. We're happy to clarify anything.
No worries. And yeah, thank you very much, everybody. And yeah, please try and complete that participation survey. Would be muchly appreciated. We then get a summary, and if there's any questions that people want to make or any comments, please be honest. It's the only way that we get better. And if you want to see research in other places or further information, now's your chance to have the say, because all your feedback goes back to the government. So, if you want more research in more remote areas to give better values for your local area in the calculators or whatever, now's your chance to have that say. So please take that opportunity to give some feedback. And otherwise, that's the end of the webinar for tonight. So thank you very much for coming. And if you want to know more about the AIA platform and the calculators and the government grant that they got to update the GAF calculators and put them onto an online platform, please go onto the AgForce Eventbrite and register for tomorrow night's webinar. And Wednesday night, we've got information on carbon farming projects and what's currently available and what's in draft form and what that might look like. So please join us tomorrow and Wednesday night if you want more information. And thank you very much, and we'll see you all later.